the touch of your lips, dear, but much more for the touch of your whips, dear. You can raise welts like nobody else as we dance to the masochism tango.
All right, everybody, welcome to another episode of Hourgasm. This is the podcast where we talk about decolonizing gender and sexuality. I am Lindsay G. I use she, her, and hers, and sometimes they and theirs pronouns.
And I am Lenny Peppers. I use she, her, and hers pronouns.
On this episode, we are going to dig our fingers into the concept and history of femininity, which, first of all, is a hard word to say. It's an even harder word to spell, and I feel like they did that to us on purpose.
I was telling one of my kids today what this episode was about, and they were like, I can't even say that word.
Seriously, too many N's, too many I's. As I was trying to do some research and take notes for this episode, I kept spelling it wrong. Putting too many P's in there. But anyway, so we're going to talk about femininity and womanhood and how those two ideas, work together or don't. Whether they're the same idea. And there's really a lot of ground to cover. I feel like this is one of those topics where we could probably come up with multiple episodes that deal with subsets of information about femininity.
Oh, yeah.
So
totally.
For now, we're just going to try to put in what we can, and then we'll have more episodes birthed out of this later on.
I think that's where we've been going with this whole first season. We talked about really broad topics, but we could dig way deeper into them and kind of single out certain subtopics in each one and still get a whole hour out of it. And I should mention that we don't much to the chagrin of our editor, these episodes don't take us an hour to record. We usually actually talk for hours, sometimes 2 hours or more on each topic, and then a lot of it gets edited out in the end. And we're trying to be better about doing an hour for our editor so that he doesn't have to edit out so much, but it's so hard. So I feel like we could talk about all the things that got edited out as well.
We could do maybe special episodes for super fans that are tidbits that were cut.
Oh, totally.
You can just guess what the hell we were talking about.
Yeah.
And you can listen to us burp.
Yeah. And sigh dreamily at each other, I guess.
Yeah. And imagine us batting our eyelashes, which we do, but you can't see it because we don't record that part. And sometimes you can hear my cat being a jerk and me yelling at him. I'm sure. I don't know if my cat being a jerk to me is going to make it into any of these episodes or not, but it does happen kind of regularly.
I hope so.
Okay, so femininity. This is obviously a huge topic, as we just said. And there's so many different angles that we could start with, but I guess maybe the easiest way to get into it is to talk about what it actually means. So the easiest entree to that is to look it up in the dictionary, which I did. I was disappointed to find that in Merriam-Webster's Unabridged Dictionary, the definition of feminine and womanly is pretty much exactly the same, which is characteristic of belonging to or suitable to women, for womanly, and for feminine, characteristic of or appropriate or peculiar to women. So it really doesn't take us very far. I guess I could look up the definition of woman, but I was kind of satisfied in being a little dissatisfied with these because that's kind of how I feel about the concept of femininity in today's culture anyway.
I went to the Urban Dictionary to look it up.
Oh no, never do that.
The top definition was the female gender role. Not all of them are exactly like this, but most are. It is in a way built to fit the male gender role, masculinity. Feminine traits include, but are not limited to, understanding, empathetic, sensitive, submissive, gentle, modest, willowy, and pretty.
Willowy?
And I feel like, yeah, yeah, which is
What?
weird.
Wait, wait. Isn't willowy what you call like a tall, thin person? Or is there like another definition to willowy? I'm looking this up.
So in the Urban Dictionary, a girl who is tall with long limbs and long hair resembling that of a willow tree, intended as a compliment. Damn, girl, you look willowy. Just kidding. I don't know.
Merriam-Webster's Unabridged says that willowy is resembling a willow, gracefully tall and slender, delicate and supple. So I guess the gracefulness, okay, delicate, okay. Not sure about like the tall aspect. That was completely out of left field. Did not see that coming. Okay. Interesting. Like the rest I can at least understand how people think that, even if I don't agree with it, but willowy I don't know about.
But I feel like the Urban Dictionary version of it, the Urban Dictionary definition of it was my favorite one of the three.
Huh. Yeah. Yeah, it gets a lot more specific. I also dug into Wikipedia, which I actually feel like is pretty good for this kind of thing because it is crowdsourced and like much more so than academic definitions. Most of us live our lives according to, crowdsourced definitions of things. So there's obviously like a large article about femininity on Wikipedia, but there were some standouts that I thought I would read. First of all, traits traditionally cited as feminine include gentleness, empathy, humility, and sensitivity.
Okay.
Let's see. And then there are quotes from different thinkers who have sort of put different ideas into play, which I won't get into just yet. Then, here's a whole list. Feel free to call any out if you don't agree with them. Traits such as nurturance, which I didn't know was a word, sensitivity, sweetness, supportiveness, gentleness, warmth, passivity, cooperativeness, expressiveness, modesty, humility, empathy, affection, tenderness, and being emotional, kind, helpful, devoted, and understanding have been cited as stereotypically feminine. So that's what we're working with as far as like what the dominant culture sees as feminine at this point in time. Okay, so we're going to talk about real quickly the fact that when we're talking about femininity and womanhood, we are unequivocally talking about expressions of gender. And for both of us, I am pretty sure I'm correct when I say this, gender to us is not connected to what you have between your legs. We both strongly believe that trans women are women, non-binary people are whatever they wish to be. As far as our working terminology here goes, sex applies to the physical attributes of your, down there region. And what we are talking about instead is the expression of self that people can identify with as more masculine or feminine, neither, both, whatever works for them. We are talking about the feminine sort of half-ish of the spectrum of gender here.
Absolutely, 100% what Lindsay just said. So I wanted to start with talking about my mom has always been, without ever calling herself a feminist, my mom has always been a feminist. She's always believed that women have the ability to do all the things that a man can do in the world. When I was really young, she actually said something to me that stuck with me for my entire life. I still think about it to this day. And she said that our people believe that a nation is not lost until its women's hearts are on the ground.
Whoa.
Yeah. And what it comes down to is I was basically raised with the belief that women are essentially the hearts of the community, and nations are created and held up by strong women.
I love that. It also sounds to me like it's getting at sort of the depth and fierceness of the female heart, like that the strength there is what upholds a people.
And then that of course, to me, working into like my area of study, which is extremely niche. For those of you who don't know, essentially I study Native representation in art and media and how we use these forms as tools of resistance. And so one thing during my studies has become incredibly clear, and that's that female Native American perspectives have been grossly neglected in mainstream media and educational curriculums. And so while I was doing my research for this, it was very, very clear to see that like so many of our stories are just gone forever now. But I just want to mention before I get into it that it's important to remember that the experience of one tribe is not necessarily the experience of another tribe.
Right. Yeah.
There are hundreds of different tribes just in this country alone.
Yeah.
It comes down to a couple of main things. First, our stories have been mostly told by white males who either only ignore Native American femininity or totally fetishize Native American femininity. And so these problems are extremely clear today when we look into the issues of murdered and missing Indigenous women.
Right.
Which outwardly shows what happens when a group of people is erased.
Right.
People don't care about what happens to them, and then fetishized, which makes us targets for violence.
Right.
So right now, to give an example of this, a single tribe here in Montana, I'm a descendant of the Crow tribe, and right now there are 28 open cases of missing women right now.
Oh my God.
In fact, Hulu covered this in their show Dead Silent, season 4, episode 8, about Rylan Rideshorse, who was a woman who was taken and tortured and burned and was found alive. So if you guys want to kind of watch that and kind of, I think they go into murdered and missing Indigenous women a little bit more as well. 84% of Native American women experience violence in their lifetime. And murder is the third leading cause of death for us.
Holy shit.
In 2016 alone, more than 5,000 women were reported missing.
Wow.
And those were the ones that were reported. More often than not, they go unreported or are like reported as other things like exposure, where you have a perfectly healthy young woman dying of exposure, like just feet from their house. And things like that.
That happens like a lot and has happened a lot recently. Just this year, there was, I think it was like at the end of last winter, maybe? God, I don't remember. But there was a young woman who went missing and was missing for like 2 weeks. And it actually got quite a lot of attention, which was really good to see. Like people were getting really fired up about it. And then she was found like right next to where she disappeared. I think it was like 100 meters away or something from where she had gone missing from after 2 weeks. And they said that she had died of exposure. And it's like, if she had been out there for 2 weeks, 100 meters away from where she disappeared, she would have been found.
Yeah. And she's not the only case from that specific area where that specific coroner has used exposure as a way that these women died.
Right.
The majority of women today with Native American ancestry do not live on reservations. They make up a considerable part of the population.
Right.
But because Native American women are basically just represented by popular culture in either the Plains context or a generic Indian context, or as a squaw.
Right.
So that's like kind of where we stand like right now in today's viewpoint. And if you want to like learn more about like the squaw representation, you can go back to the Disney episode where we talked about that a little bit more in depth.
Yeah. Would I be correct in saying that, like, at least from my, like, I feel like anytime that I have heard the term squaw applied to a character or something, it's like this like voiceless person who kind of like follows men around. Am I?
Well, the squaw is the in between the maiden and like the crone, like parts of Native American womanhood in media. It's a stereotype, and it is everything from a woman who is kind of a servant, but is always a like beast of burden, and sexless, even almost genderless, just made to like carry babies and do work. And yeah, they don't have a voice, but that can be attributed to the fact that media in the past has tended to take voices away from all Native people, except for when they're being like violent.
Right. War whoops are okay.
Yeah.
Clearly.
In the media. Yeah. And so because the Native is usually like completely like gone unless they're needed to forward a plot in the or like movie or a storyline.
Yeah.
Native American women, therefore, are even more like invisible.
Right. Yeah. Yeah. That tracks for me. I feel like there's something too about like what you said as kind of like depicting Native women as like workhorses. Like there is something to that I can't quite wrap my brain around, but like there's a reason that they are often depicted that way, and I think it's something about like how quote unquote unfeminine it is to do hard work. Like,
yeah.
In white, Eurocentric and now American culture, like women are supposed to not be active workers. Like you are more feminine if you have soft hands, right?
Yeah, and all through history it's been that way. But in addition to that, the counterpart to the squaw is the buck, who is considered to be lazy, and so the squaw stereotype is actually like carrying the weight of both her and the buck, like within like this stereotypical world.
Oh, that's interesting, because both of those gender roles go against the dominant culture's version of like the man should be the energetic one who does all the work. So we're going to depict Native American men as the opposite of that, and then switcheroo for the women so that they're clearly even farther othered.
Yeah. For Native American women, when creating and adapting gender roles to modern day women, there's like this continued play with the traditional role of housekeeper, childbearer, and nurturer. But because, and I'm talking about this next, but because we were originally culturally like didn't have these specific attributes put upon us, when we were confined to these roles, we no longer enjoyed like the unquestioned positions of power, respect, and decision making that were often a part of our cultural views.
Okay. I have always heard that one of the reasons that so much has been lost in translation and then carried into like lawmaking and, the carrying out of genocide against Native Americans has been based on the fact that like when white dudes showed up to trade with, talk to, translate from, learn about Native Americans, because they were coming from such a patriarchal background, they more or less assumed that the men were the leaders, that the men were the people with the positions of power. So they ended up talking to the men and taking what they said as sort of the be all and end all. And then rules were made, laws were made, wars were fought with the idea that the power was, strictly on the male side, like it was for European Americans. And that's just, it's not true. That's not how things worked. It was how we chose to see it.
Right, exactly. Pre-colonial Native America was more diverse than the entire continent of Europe. And so again,
Wow.
I can't speak for like an entire group of really diverse people.
Right.
But to give some examples throughout history, many women were leaders in Native American tribes. For instance, Cherokee women worked in treaty negotiations with the United States.
Mm-hmm.
The women in the Haudenosaunee Confederacy acted and continue to act as political leaders and chose chiefs. We have tribes here in Montana that also have women leaders who wear headdresses. And in fact, today, like the entire Cheyenne president and council is women. And so women, even though they were delegated tasks of caring for children and preparing meals and other roles, which varied between tribal groups, many women were responsible for tending fields, and there were long periods of time where men were off hunting or at war. Men and women, I should say, because women were also allowed to do those things in many of the tribes.
Yeah.
The women were left behind to do all of the work and basically had significant control over the social and economic factors within the tribes, entirely, while the men were away. And so there were hundreds of tribes, hundreds of ways of interpreting these roles.
Right. Yeah. Of interpreting femininity.
Right. Exactly. Women fought in war, like Buffalo Calf Road woman.
Right.
Who is said to be the person who killed Custer.
Yeah.
And she was like pretty good on a horse. There's a story about her. She's known as the girl who saved her brother. And she was also the survivor of several massacres in American history.
Oh, wow.
Yeah, so definitely like look up her and her story. My own great-grandmother was a tribal delegate for the Northern Cheyenne tribe and a tribal leader. And my grandmother and mother were all very active in politics.
Yeah.
So I guess I've been raised to question the gender roles that have been put before me in terms of like, this is what you're supposed to do.
That's awesome. Good. Good. Because these gender roles are stupid, I think. I mean, if anybody is surprised by me saying that, maybe this is the first episode you've listened to or something. But not super into traditional feminine roles, etc., etc.
Same.
I want to ask, like, so how has that all changed since colonization? But like, that is an incredibly huge question, and probably not one that can just like be quickly answered. But I wonder if you have any thoughts on that general topic.
One of the problems is that it appears that Native American males have also adopted the pattern of colonial violence, which is manifested through domestic and sexual violence, child abuse, and homophobia. I mean, the whole point of our podcast is to bring these issues to light.
Right.
But since we're dealing with like multi-generational constructions, it'll basically take more than just us to change this.
Damn it.
But like one thing is clear though, equality will not be attained if historical oppressive behaviors are not addressed, discussed, and changed. And so like this is just us doing our part. And we can't talk about this topic of femininity without discussing also the colonial violence that comes along with femininity when it applies to really all women, but for me specifically, Indigenous women.
Yeah. And there's a lot to unpack in there. And we touched on this in our last episode, but I think it's really something that like can't be stated often enough. Which is that like when a force comes into a group of people's lives and systematically strips them of their culture, history, language, and dynamics within the group, that group is going to have little choice but to assimilate to, you know, the larger culture. And I have in my life come across people who say things like, well, that was all a long time ago. Native Americans should move on or get over it, or, you know, any number of incredibly insensitive things like that. And I don't have the words to explain how short-sighted that is, but I think that's why we have to keep coming back to it in these episodes.
Oh, yeah. Like, the reason why we can't get over it is because these ideological concepts still affect us in the real world today, to this very day.
Yeah.
I can say that it was better for the survival of our people as a whole to base roles around within the tribe around one's aptitude rather than what sexual organs they happen to be born with. And so I think that's why the idea of femininity is so much more broad in Indigenous story work and history.
Yeah.
A big problem in society today is the vague half-truths that construct the negative and degrading images of Native American women that the American public accepts as truth.
Okay. No.
So Native authors strive to conjure like a positive and current image that truthfully respects the modern Native woman, and contemporary females of Indigenous nations especially are a group without great representation, but are politically and heavily covered in American media. Like I said, Hulu has that whole show episode dedicated to this topic, but they overlook us as a group in need of a strong voice to represent our population positively.
Yeah. This just came up recently. There's a show, I think it's on one of the major TV networks, called Big Sky. And I saw a trailer for it before it aired. And it's a show about women going missing off of the highways in Montana. And the women are white. They're like white and blonde even. Like, and I think they're supposed to be like travelers from California or something who are like on a road trip. They go missing at a truck stop. And it becomes this big thing. And it turns out that there's a pattern going on and all these women are going missing from truck stops. You're telling the actual stories of hundreds of Native women who have gone missing from Montana, often at truck stops or rest areas along the highway.
Mm-hmm.
But you're just completely cutting the Native women out of the entire story.
Yeah, totally.
I was so offended. I think I wrote something nasty on Twitter about it, and many other people did too.
Yeah.
And I actually did see recently that like the producers of the show like have spoken with some Native women leaders and have like apologized.
But then they like made a show episode that took place on one of the reservations here in Montana that was like about a Native American councilwoman, but they didn't like talk to the tribe at all. They didn't talk to the people, and they didn't like do it in a way that was like respectful. And so then they were in trouble like immediately after they apologized, because they tried to fix it by not talking to Native Americans about it, by just doing whatever they want to do, and by telling the story the way that they wanted to tell it without any input.
I mean, that was just like the most recent and a very stark example of like literally making the specifically Native American, even more specifically female Native American experience invisible, like just completely ignoring it, even though that is actually the story that you are telling.
And then again, telling the story without actually talking to Native American people about it. I'm literally the person that you can come to in Montana to talk about film. I mean, people write me from New York with their scripts and ask me to read through them and like how they can make it better. But I am literally like 30 miles away from where this was, you know, happening, and like a half an hour away from where this is happening. And they couldn't contact the Montana Film Office and be like, how do we do this right? You know, I don't know.
P.S. Anyone out there who is, you know, looking for input on this kind of stuff, you can hire Lenny for that. She's very good,
Yeah.
highly respected in her field. Just saying.
I should also mention that when I talk about murdered and missing Indigenous women, what I mean is murdered and missing Indigenous women and people. Historically, Native acceptance of genderqueer people is unmatched in America today, where they're considered outside of the norm. And while we've made significant improvement today in the treatment and acknowledgement of transgendered people, it's still not enough. And so I think it's important when we talk about murdered and missing Indigenous women to also acknowledge that genderqueer people are also a target and erased in culture today. And so I want to make sure that we include that in our conversations.
Right. Yeah. There's been more visibility, I think, being gained by sort of the I don't know if it's an actual movement, but I'm going to call it like the Two-Spirit movement, as just a way of including multiple people with different gender expressions, some of whom we might be able to identify as like trans, according to sort of the dominant culture's definition of that. But then there's so much more diversity within the Two-Spirit like umbrella, I guess.
Mm-hmm.
I think it's wonderful, because if we are dealing with gender as more or less a spectrum, which is how I tend to look at it, you can be anywhere along there. Sometimes one day you can be more in this direction, and the next day maybe more in that direction. And I think it's all fair. I think it's all awesome. I think it could be in like my ideal like utopian like super hippie version of like a decolonized future. Like we just all are what we are, and we identify however we identify, and it's not a big deal, and people are just celebrated for who they are. And I see a lot of the potential for that in
absolutely. And all of our roles are around our aptitude rather than like how big our boobs are. Yeah.
All boobs are beautiful.
I actually have been following the Two-Spirit movement very closely because I have a genderqueer child who chooses to not be defined by male or female, but just goes by whatever they feel like on whatever day that they feel like doing it. And I fully support that.
That's so cool. That's so cool. I mean, we could definitely do an entire episode on like gender expression and queerness, and how all of that works. But I want to say like real quick that I know a lot of people have a lot of difficulty around pronouns, especially for, folks like your child who, may feel like their pronouns vary from time to time. And I know a lot of people are like, well, it's just really hard to remember to call you they instead of he or she or whatever, and making it about themselves and how hard it is for them. But I don't understand why it's so hard, because like, if you know somebody whose name is Richard and they prefer to go by Rick, you don't call them Dickie. Like you call them Rick because that's what they prefer to be called, and it makes them comfortable. So like if we can do that for nicknames and variations on people's names, I don't understand what is so hard about respecting people's pronouns. Like it does take a little bit of reprogramming of like grammar rules if you've been taught that they only applies to plural instead of singular. Just
grammar rules are colonial anyway. I can say that the more you do it, the easier it gets. And so just do it. Like, damn. Like, what?
Yeah, just figure it out. It isn't that hard. And if you screw up, then you just apologize to the person and move on. It really is like, it's
exactly.
I have occasionally screwed up at like when I've been drinking or something and like done the whole like, oh God, mea culpa, like, oh, I called you by the wrong pronouns. I'm the worst person ever. I'm trying so hard. And oh my God, I think it's been a really long time, at least, since I've had the kind of like self-loathing that I do after one of those incidents, because like me screwing up and calling you the wrong thing is not about me. It's about me trying to respect you and doing the best that I can. It's a respect thing. So that's just, I don't know, quick little lesson for anybody out there who has trouble with pronouns. Like, just do your best. Make it about the other person and their comfort and your respect for them. Like, it's not so.
I've gotten to the point where I'm just like, I'm sorry, they, them. Anyway, moving on. You know, it doesn't have to be a big thing.
Yeah. Yeah. Nobody really like needs to hear your whole like song and dance about how sorry you are every time.
Yeah.
It gets I'm sure it gets very old for people who hear it a lot.
Yeah.
Well, so we've talked a lot about the pre-colonial concepts of femininity and how those have changed since colonization. And so now here we find ourselves in the modern world, in the new millennium, the 21st.
Yeah.
And there's been a lot of upset, like even just like in the past few years, about femininity, like in the culture and what it looks like. Because there's been the Me Too movement, which has led to a lot of people blatantly identifying as feminists and then really like just deconstructing what feminism means now, how it can be different across different groups and intersectionality. Like there's been a lot of exploration of femininity in our culture.
You could see it in the media today where like in the 1990s, 1980s, even the mid 20th century, where you have like these really feminine women, and then you have like the outsider, not like other girls girl, who's kind of breaking down like these feminine tropes. But the thing about that person, the thing about that character, and the reason why those characters are so popular is because more people identify with those characters than they do with the feminine person, because more people kind of fall in other places on the spectrum than like way over on like the most feminine end.
Yeah, totally. Yeah, and like that's just a numbers game. Like it makes sense, and yet we are shown repeatedly these versions of like the utmost extreme of femininity, and you know, we're not necessarily explicitly instructed to behave like, say, who's an ultra feminine, Sleeping Beauty, because I love that movie. And I think that like honestly one of the parts of Sleeping Beauty, the movie, that I like the least is actually Briar Rose. She is like kind of the ultimate Disney princess feminine character. She can talk to the animals. She sings so sweetly. She always wears a dress. You know, she's super slim and sprightly and graceful. She has all of the feminine traits that we have been taught are feminine. And like, you know, nobody in my growing up experience ever like pushed me up against a wall and said you have to act like Briar Rose.
Well, not specifically, but I do feel like we are told what to do, and I'm gonna argue with you on this one. When we're told to act like a lady.
Oh yes, that's a good one. And that's kind of the thing. Like, it's rare that we're explicitly told, like, okay, do these 5 things, and you will be performing femininity correctly. But when you constantly see those same 5 things exhibited in the heroine character or in advertising or whatever, and then you layer that with act like a lady, it amounts to the explicit laying out of the rules.
Right. But the rules, like you said, are not really like actually defined. It's like dress up, but not too much. Like don't dress down. Wear makeup, but don't wear too much makeup.
Have big boobs, but not too big boobs.
Yeah. Smile, but don't like smile too big.
Oh,
you know?
Yeah. You know who is coming to mind like for me, I think she's been in the media a lot recently. But I also was watching like a Pee Wee Herman special where she was on. I don't know why recently.
Pee Wee Herman special.
I love Pee Wee Herman, and we could have a whole episode on Pee Wee Herman and masculinity. That would be but
that sounds good.
Dolly Parton.
Yeah.
I feel like in a lot of ways, Dolly Parton is kind of like the American like uber female.
Yeah. So one of the things for I love Dolly Parton.
Oh,
For
God,
one, I think she's self-made. She is just awesome. And she's what comes to mind when women say they, quote, have it all.
Oh,
She has, she's famous.
yeah.
She dresses the way that she wants to dress. She does the
Mhm.
things that she wants to do.
She's successful as hell.
Mm-hmm. Like, it's like she learned the rules and then broke them, like just enough.
Yeah. Yeah. So I was raised by a mother who I think really in her way is very strongly feminist. And like the older she gets, the more feminist she gets. But her personal gender performance and decisions were very much based around motherhood and housekeeping. And that's where she feels comfortable and what she wants to do. So she's an interesting person for me to examine. I swear I'm not going to go on forever about my mother, but like she's very feminine in a lot of ways, but never really particularly presented as feminine, like has always had short hair my entire life, was always very into sports, things that aren't typically super feminine. And she also did not enforce hyper-femininity on me or my sisters. But at the same time, we did get a lot of like act like a lady. And I remember specifically my mother having a problem with Dolly Parton when I was a kid before I really knew who she was, because we didn't really listen to like country music, so she was just kind of a general celebrity that I was vaguely aware of.
Mm-hmm.
But my mom had a problem with the fact that she had big fake boobs,
Mm-hmm.
that she dyed her hair, that she wore too much makeup, and it was kind of confusing for me because I'm like, but she's doing all the things that make you like the correct woman, right?
Yeah, like her house. When I went to Hawaii, I had to go look at her house. It was like a pink mansion. It was like painted pink. The walls on the outside are pink.
Oh my God. That's so
it's almost like she like took the rules and like blew them up.
yeah. Yeah, and she has talked about that. I've seen like video of her talking about how like she based most of her look on the town sex worker when she was like she looked at that woman and was like, that's what I want to look like. She's awesome.
Yeah. She's beautiful.
And I think that is amazing, number one, because the a sex worker can be a role model. Surprise, that is a real thing.
Yeah.
And I feel like Dolly kind of did look at like the uber feminine characters and be like, okay, I'm going to do that, but more. I'm going to do it harder and better. And it's almost like doing drag.
Like her femininity became her power. She took the concept that was supposed to like keep us in these pretty little cages, and she flipped it to give herself power.
Yeah.
And what it comes down to is like men feel entitled to women. And so a woman who doesn't follow these rules are generally cast out of society.
Mm-hmm.
If you look at women who have done things like this historically, we have like them literally cast out of society and seen as witches or monsters or temptresses.
Mm-hmm.
And or when a man does something, it's strategic, but when a woman does something, it's calculated. And while a man is allowed to react, a woman can only overreact.
Right.
And so when we're looking at Dolly Parton, some people would say that like the way that she looks is calculated so that she would get seen more and that she would get more famous, rather than strategic, like as if like a man who was exhibiting hypermasculinity, John Wayne.
We pick on John Wayne a lot.
Did the same thing.
So that makes me think of like a few things. What you said about like women reacting is overreacting made me think about like one thing that I've been thinking about a lot as we've been coming up to recording this is how, although there are rules about what is feminine and what is not feminine, the actual like shape of what femininity is in the dominant culture right now is very vague. It's very nebulous. Like the tomboy as a celebrated archetype in especially American femininity. Like you can still be considered feminine and be a tomboy and play sports with the boys and so on. That is not necessarily a huge strike against your femininity. And in a way that like a boy who expresses himself more effeminately, he's like kicked out of the boy club. He's kicked out of the man club. He is seen as homosexual and or effeminate and therefore less of a man. But there isn't really that same kind of policing of expressions of femininity.
Well, I think that for the tomboy archetype, though, while they're accepted in their childhood, the second that they go through puberty, they're expected to start embodying the feminine.
True,
so when we see them in film, the tomboy in film, there's always a turning point toward the end, even in like TV shows and stuff where they're friends with like their tomboy neighbor, best friend, whatever, the whole time. And then they decide to like go to a dance together, and then she overreacts and is like, we're in love now, and then shows up to the dance like in full makeup and in a gown and whatever, and then the kid freaks out and is like, oh my god, that's not my friend anymore, you know.
Yeah, that's a really good point. And if you continue with the tomboyness after puberty, then you're more or less written off as a lesbian. Lesbians are so invisibilized culturally speaking. Like unless they are performing their sexuality for the benefit of men, there's just so little representation of lesbians in our culture.
Totally.
And again though, like it comes back to the idea that like if you were assigned male at birth, if you are a person who was assigned male at birth, and as you're growing up you exhibit more stereotypically feminine characteristics, you are more likely to be cast out of the man club. Like you are not welcome here. You are no longer masculine. We want nothing to do with you. Whereas I feel like there isn't that same kind of policing of what is feminine from inside femininity. Like there isn't as strict a control over what is feminine and what is not. And I have a theory about it, which is that it's because femininity is less of its own thing and more of like the mirror of what masculinity is not.
Right. Like even historically in Europe, men were characterized as reasonable and rational, while women acted based around their emotions and intuition.
Women.
But you can define reasonable and rational. Like you can scientific, like everything in science is defined with reason and ration.
Yeah.
But when you try and define something in science based on emotion and intuition, you can't really do it. And I feel like the concept is the same when it comes to like just physically who we are.
Right. Like men are big, therefore women are small. Men are active, therefore women are passive. It's almost like any attribute that gets attributed to the male gender, feminine people just get whatever is the opposite of that. So
by default, we're defined as the opposite of whatever male characteristic is being presented at that moment.
Even more so the lack of it. So it's like more of like a void than an actual category unto itself.
Which again, like makes the definition of femininity is entirely based on the definition of what is masculine.
Exactly. And it also makes it more slippery. So like, if like Dolly Parton was trying to do femininity and my mom was like, oh, well, I don't like her because she's too feminine. It's like, well, what? There's like, there's no comfortably feminine place that you can just be in where somebody isn't going to be telling you that you're doing it wrong.
Morticia Addams pulls it off.
Oh, I love Morticia Addams. Yes, please, let's talk about Morticia Addams.
Morticia Addams is feminine, but she's kind of just doing whatever she feels like doing at any given time. She's beautiful. She does have cleavage. She's
boy, does she.
willowy. She's like
She is
defined.
willowy. You're
She
right.
is.
She's got the willowy thing going on.
And this is a quote from her from one of the Addams Family movies. I'm just like any modern woman trying to have it all. Loving husband, a family. I just wish I had more time to seek out the dark forces and join their hellish crusade.
I feel the same way.
But what it comes down to is Morticia is like a feminist queen, and she does have it all. She's not only able to do whatever she feels like doing, whether it's rational or emotional, but she can define like her own style, while at the same time having children and a husband who adore her for being who she is.
And she is outwardly sexually voracious.
Yeah.
Like she pursues Gomez for sex actively. And that is something that, oh boy, I could definitely do an entire episode of me just talking about my feelings about female sexual passivity as the norm. And I think that one reason that I love Morticia Addams so much is that she is clearly not that way. And yet she is ultra feminine. And there's something really powerful about that.
I mean, I think this character is doing the same thing that the real life person, Dolly Parton, is doing, except from the other direction. She's coming from, she's already like, should be ostracized from society, but she's put into like this, like suburban kind of world. And she is already considered a witch or whatever.
Right.
But then she comes in from that direction and then kills it. It's like she just like rocks it.
She slaughters it. But I have to point out here, we're calling Dolly and Morticia sort of our like ultra feminine have it all people. However, Morticia does not have a career. Dolly does not have children.
True.
So I see absolutely nothing wrong with either of those things, because I think people should be entitled to do whatever they want. But I do think that when we are talking about the like women can have it all, we tend to mean the career and the kids.
Right.
Which is that's the eternal question of like whether you can really do it both ways. And that's probably something that we could discuss much more in like a motherhood oriented episode. But I mean, obviously femininity and motherhood are so completely intertwined that it would be silly not to mention it here.
That's what's dangerous about women, is that we control creation. And not only that, but recently we found that we don't even need men to control creation. We can make babies with our own bone marrow, and those babies will only be female.
Look out, world.
Yeah. But happening. I should also mention that I have a career and 6 children and a house. And
you know, that's a good point.
So I prove that, you know, this is a real thing.
You do have it.
I have it all.
And you know what all 3 of you have? Supportive, significant others. And
absolutely.
I think that is what is often missing from the conversation about how somebody can have it all. Because if we have a masculine identifying person who is very successful, we more or less assume that that person is probably married and probably has children and has the support of the spouse, you know, on their side. But that is very different when we're talking about a feminine identified individual. Like anytime that a woman with kids is interviewed in the media, it's like 9 times out of 10 at least, they're going to be asked about like, well, why aren't you home with your kids?
Oh, I get asked that just at comedy shows where I'm performing.
Wow.
Like, where are your children?
Yeah, like because obviously your spouse or significant other or other support network people couldn't be watching your kids for you, because as a mother and as a woman, that is your role.
Yeah. Or
And
somebody asked me once if my house was a wreck because I was always like back when I was doing more comedy, I was on the road all the time. And I was like, well, my husband does laundry and the dishes and cooks all the meals. And so it's not really like there's any chore being neglected. It's just that, I'm not doing the traditional roles. And so therefore it's assumed that they're not getting done at all.
Right. I don't understand how people don't think that mindset is insulting to your husband and your children. Like, what are they just incapable of doing things? Like, what?
Yeah.
They just sit around and twiddle their thumbs when you're not around. Like, oh gosh, what are we gonna do? And it's interesting too. I was thinking about this as I was reading today, like how a lot of what feminism is fighting against for a long time is the infantilization of women, like seeing us as so passive and so accommodating and so on and so forth. But the role that has been ascribed to women in like the family unit, which is to do everything for everyone, is the exact opposite of infantilization. Because I hate to say this, most dudes don't know how to do laundry. Most dudes can't fend for themselves in a house. Like, that's why we have the whole trope of like bachelors living in complete squalor. Like, they are not encouraged to take care of their surroundings and their health and clean things on their own.
So that's because they're encouraged to find somebody to do that for them.
Right. And so it's bizarre to me how women are infantilized and seen as helpless. And that's a huge part of what femininity is, because masculinity is supposed to be the opposite. But when it comes to like basic tasks, dudes are not doing so hot. They're kind of infants in that way.
Well, I talked about this in the last episode where statistically men's amount of work goes down and women's amount of work actually goes up significantly when men and women move in with each other.
Right. Who's the infant now?
Yeah.
It's
like bizarre. Like we've been raised to be caregivers, and then our own experience as like having to be caregivers is used against us to keep us in the household.
Yes, abso-freaking-lutely. And that might go back to our conversation about like the nuclear family a lot also. As we had discussed, like in most pre-colonized societies that I am aware of, there's very much like a group feeling where, everybody's helping look after everybody else's kids. So if somebody has to go do something, you don't have to worry about it, right? There's not like one person in this group that is responsible for caretaking everybody. There's a whole lot of people who are responsible for caretaking everybody. And like stripped of that in a much more nuclear family setting, the feminine adult in the situation is supposed to somehow become this superwoman and take care of everything for everyone. And that is literally what is expected of feminine people. And it's like not possible. And it is stressing us out. Like I have been getting little bits and pieces. I haven't done a whole deep dive into this, but I am starting to get the impression that women in America do not sleep. Most of the people I know who are affected by insomnia, myself included, are women. And like we are so stressed out. We are so stressed out. There is so much placed on our shoulders. And I'm sure that that is true for people who identify as male. Also,
and for my husband, I sleep like a damn baby every single night. But my husband stays up and goes and gets some of the laundry done and checks on all the kids to make sure they're all sleeping and make sure they're, and so, I mean, it's exactly what you're saying is like, this is too much for one person to handle. And so by dividing these roles up, like these household roles specifically to this conversation right now, unequally, then you're kind of expecting like too much out of the other person in the relationship.
Right. Yeah. You're expecting the person to take care of you and anyone else in the household, while you play your video games or whatever your thing is, and it's unrealistic, it's unfair, and
Okay, I will help James out more. I get it, okay? Just kidding.
I mean, I wasn't gonna say anything, but
no, but like the problem with this is that there are definitely studies done on this, but there aren't enough studies done on it because medical trials are made for men.
Yeah.
Women are not like the main subject immediately for every single medical trial that exists.
Yeah, and pretty much like all of our medical science is based on the male body. Like the groundwork of what we know about the human body is all male bodies.
Yep.
And I shouldn't say that. I should say cisgender men's bodies, to be specific here.
Right.
So like we really don't understand how things work for cisgender women's bodies, and especially we don't understand trans people's bodies.
Not as much as we could if, I mean, even medication is made for, like, doses of medication is made for men.
Absolutely.
And cisgender male bodies.
I am able to take a half dose of almost everything, like over-the-counter medication, unless I'm having like a really bad day. Like I can usually take 1 pill instead of 2 if 2 is the regular dose, and I'm fine. And even like my prescription medications, I literally have to cut them in half. But that's a whole other thing. Oh, no, go ahead.
A couple more like statistics on the same line though, when we look at like feminine body features, things like seatbelts are made for men's bodies. So 47% of women are more likely to suffer injuries in a car crash.
Yeah.
For every female character in the movies, there are 2.24 more male characters in movies. Wow. There's women still in jail right now for driving.
Oh, yeah, that's true.
Yep. And women in the military are more likely to be killed by fellow soldiers than in battle. All of this is coming down to there have been actually communities formed around the world that are specifically for women to escape gender-based violence. Yeah. Like there's actual full communities like in Finland and Kenya, where in order to get away from like violence that's caused by perpetuating these ideas of gender, you have to create a whole community just to get away from it.
I just had a thought, which we could talk about for way longer than we have time for, but we can come back to it in other discussions. The idea of women as being passive and being the receivers is, I am certain, without having looked it up, is intrinsically linked to women as being the penetrated in sex. Like, we are literally the receivers of, heteronormative heterosexual sex. And so I am 100% certain that a lot of our receptivity, passivity, quietness and demureness is because that is how dominant culture, i.e. the patriarchy, has portrayed us.
Yes.
I feel like there is a certain aspect of like our being passive that is extrapolated into violence very easily. Like I think that women as being receptacles or receivers for male physicality and emotions, there is something there that's tying these two together. Like, you are the site upon which I dump my negativity, my fears, my anger, my violence, because you are the receiver, so I will give it all to you. And we're raised that way. Like we were just talking about how, women in the household are supposed to be the everything, the one person support network. And the role of masculinity, the roles that people who are masculine are taught that they must embody are so strictly enforced that I feel as if there's an enormous amount of pressure on masculine people, and the feminine people in their lives end up being the pressure release valve, where like everything just gets dumped onto them, and that includes violence and abuse.
Right. Yeah, absolutely.
But I was just going to be like, so just don't be passive, people. But that is clearly not an answer, because feminine identified people who are not passive, things often don't go well for them. But again, that's like a whole thing that we could get into that will make me extremely depressed that we really don't have time to fit in this episode.
Yeah, but I do think that it is important to note that if you step out of your role as a lady, and step into the characteristics of what people think are masculine, then people are still upholding these male supremacist ideologies. That person is more likely to get violence than those who don't.
Right.
And so sometimes it's easier just to do your thing and, not do what Dolly Parton has done.
Right.
It's sometimes worse for people who want to step into that bigger role.
Yeah. If breaking those gender norms, even though femininity as a concept may not be as strictly defined as masculinity, stepping outside of the suggested behaviors for femininity and for performing femininity is extremely dangerous.
Also, stepping into roles of traditional femininity and out of the roles of masculinity for people who prefer, that side is also equally dangerous, because you're like exposing yourself to that patriarchal view of the receptacle.
Right. Yeah. And for some reason, like enraging cisgender dudes who, like, I don't understand why there is so much anger about, especially, people who were raised to be masculine or started out as more masculine and then move over into the more feminine area of things, like trans women. I don't understand what the problem is. Like, is it like the home team is like mad that you're leaving? Is it that they're jealous that they can express themselves?
No. Men don't get those kind of feelings. They're not overreacting. They're just reacting.
Oh, right. Yeah, it's totally legit. They're not being hysterical. They're asserting themselves.
Right. And those of us who stand up to it are overreacting and being hysterical.
Right. Yeah. It's so wild. I feel like there's just a huge conversation to be had about how, like, you can't perform femininity right. Like, no matter where you started and where you end up, there's just nobody's ever going to be like, hey, good job. Hey, here's your female card. Like,
yeah, it doesn't make any sense, because from where I'm sitting, where I grew up in a family of cowboys, extremely toxic, masculine group of people, men can do everything, including what a woman can do, but don't. But
if I wanted to do these dishes, I would do them so much better than you do.
Yeah, but then, like, those who do step into the female gender roles would be considered doing it better, and yet men get so mad when somebody who is seen as masculine actually does it.
Yeah, like, where's the anger coming from? I just don't understand that part. Like, there's some like visceral connection in their heart to, like, oh no, someone's doing something unmanly. It personally offends me. I don't get what that is about. And there's so much violence.
Dangerous, because women are the controllers of creation, and by controlling women, you're controlling creation.
But that's the thing. Not all women can create life. That's trans women and non-trans women alike. Like, not everybody can have babies. So, like, I think that you're right. Like, it is tied to that, like, fear of the feminine as this mysterious and powerful force, but that it's a very symbolic tie. Like, in the moment of a bunch of dudes who just discovered that they had been hitting on someone who is a trans woman, getting angry and beating the hell out of that woman. Like, what
But that's
What
my
is
whole
the power?
point, is that it is all symbolic. None of it is real. And that technically all people are responsible for, how humanity is right now. And so
Mhm.
to really separate those two and say that this is why entirely based on creation, but then you find that people get angry when those norms are broken down by the people who are in the middle of these two sides of the spectrum.
Mm.
It comes to the triangle of money, power, and sex. When you are breaking down those things by not following the rules, then it makes people angry who are upholding those things.
Oh, right. Like they're spending all of their energy on upholding that triangle. And when they see
Mhm.
somebody who's not doing it the way that they're doing it or just isn't doing it at all, it's like the people who are getting really mad right now because they're talking about possibly forgiving some student loan debt. And all of these people are like, you can't forgive other people's student loan debts because I paid off my student loans the hard way. And it's like, so what? Like, so you worked really hard. I'm sorry, that sucks, but like, why do you want to make other people suffer? It's the same mind.
Yeah. Like, you shouldn't have had to work that hard, and people shouldn't have to do that today. People should
Right.
be able to buy houses without having to like figure out how to pay off all of their student loan debt.
Yeah. And people should
Just
be able to like,
because
dress how they want to dress and express themselves how they want to express themselves. And just because you, sir, have decided to uphold all of the norms that the patriarchy has thrust upon you, that sucks for you. I'm sorry that you're uncomfortable with it, but like you don't have to take it out on other people who live differently.
well, it's because they're benefiting from it. When you're benefiting from it and you even kind of inherently like feel that like beneficial relationship that you have with power is being taken away,
Oh, right.
even by somebody else not following the rules, then you're going to want to do everything you can to keep that power. And that's like the same problem that we have with a lot of systemic issues in the United States today.
Yeah.
When
Yeah.
you're not upholding the rules of gender, then you're saying that white straight males should not be the ones holding all the power.
Oh my God, you're totally right. That's it. That's the thing. Yeah.
All right, well, we did it. Let's celebrate.
Pop the champagne. Let's do this.
Yeah.
Solving
We
the
don't even
world's
need a
problems.
second season now.
Yeah. Oh my God. So this is our feminine finale
Yeah.
of season 1, where we have cracked open some of the biggest topics about sexuality and gender in the colonized world, which is the world that we live in right now. So we're just getting started, people. I'm so excited. We have a giant list of topics that we want to cover, some of which are like smaller categories nested under topics we've already discussed, most of which we're going to come back to that triangle of sex, money, and power, which is probably what we should have just named the podcast. Damn it. Yeah. But I don't know what we're going to start back with, because we have this huge list that we've got to go through and like pick our topics. But I think next season we're looking at doing some more interviews. So we'll have more guests on and getting into more specific topics that we can really like dig into.
Is there any that you're specifically like excited about?
I'm particularly interested in talking more specifically about sex. Like, I think because we were doing a lot of like large overview episodes this season, sex was always like brought up, but not really like focused on. And I have so many thoughts. And
totally.
lots of people who can talk fluently about sex from many different angles. One thing that I wanted to talk about today, but didn't fit in, is how promiscuity, or the lack thereof, fits into definitions of femininity.
There's lots of topics that, like you said, are more like based in sex and sexuality, but I feel like these main topics that we discussed in the first season are extremely important foundations to jump off into deeper topics of sex.
Agreed. Agreed. We're going to go deep into sex soon. It's going to get very sexy in here.
Yeah.
Hit us back up pretty soon for season 2. So this is Lindsay G.
This is Lenata Peppers. Oh my God. What did I do? I just used my full name.
And you used your like professor voice.
I did.
Liked that. Okay, everybody. We have to sign off now because I have to get Lenny to use that voice more often. Like right now. Okay, bye.
Ciao.
Let our love be a flame, not an ember. Say it's me that you want to dismember. Blacken my eye, set fire to my tie as we dance to the masochism tango. At your command, before you here I stand. My heart is in my hand. Ugh. It's here that I must be. My heart entreats. Just hear those savage beats, and go put on your cleats and come and trample me. Your heart is hard as stone or mahogany. That's why I'm in such exquisite agony. My soul is on fire, it's aflame with desire, which is why I perspire when we tango. You caught my nose in your left castanet, love. I can feel the pain yet, love, every time I hear drums. And I envy the rose that you held in your teeth, love, with the thorns underneath, love, sticking into your gums. Your eyes cast a spell that bewitches. The last time I needed 20 stitches to sew up the gash that you made with your lash as we dance to the masochism tango. Bash in my brain and make me scream with pain, then kick me once again and say we'll never part. I know too well I'm underneath your spell, so darling, if you smell something burning, it's my heart. Excuse me. Take your cigarette from its holder and burn your initials in my shoulder. Fracture my spine and swear that you're mine as we dance to the masochism tango.